So if you were paying attention, you may have noticed there are some lovely metaphors in today's scriptures. I love imagining, like the psalmist, that it is possible for us to be like trees, strong and deeply rooted, growing by streams of water, yielding the fruit of love and peace in our lives. I want my life to be a lush green landscape like that. And I love thinking, like James, about the fruit of righteousness that is sown in peace by those who make peace. I picture a gentle gardener patiently cultivating fruits that the fast-paced world is often too impatient to grow. But I'll confess that my first impulse is to cherry pick these pretty verses right out of the passages and leave the rest. Leave aside those stark images of wickedness, cruelty, discord. Leave aside the way these passages seem to set up a strict dichotomy between wisdom and folly, righteousness and wickedness. I don't know about you, but I want to resist most attempts to paint the world as so black and white. I tend to see the world as gray most of the time. Flowers can grow in parched lands too, right? I've seen enemies become friends. I've seen illiterate people make brilliant observations. I've known incarcerated folks to show great love and integrity. I'm more drawn to those Bible stories with complex characters who are both saint and sinner. But in today's scriptures, there are really only two options, two ways, two kinds of people. This is not a Venn diagram. There's no overlap. There are those who pretend to be wise, but are actually full of selfishness, envy, untruth, disputes. And there are those who are truly wise, full of mercy and gentleness and peace. The selfish, wicked group, it is implied, are near to the devil. The truly wise are near God. Now, maybe you have a more analytical brain than I do, and maybe this way of speaking makes sense to you. Or maybe your experiences have led you to a sense that we have to tell it like it is. The world really is divided into two distinct camps. Maybe you have read enough in the Bible to know we can't just skip over these passages. Jesus himself often spoke in dichotomies. There was the wise and the foolish builder. There were the blessings and the woes, the followers and the hypocrites. But even still, can you understand my concern about dividing people into these categories? I mean, isn't division the problem these days? Aren't we too quick to paint one side as good and one as evil? In the midst of an election season, the rhetoric is only heating up again. One side characterizes the other as fascist, undemocratic, deplorable. The other side characterizes its foes as entitled and lazy at best, or pet eaters, criminals, and not even people at worst. Now, whether any of these accusations have merit and which one is worse, that's not the point. The point is that these days, as a nation, we seem quite happy to divide the world neatly into two groups. As pastor and writer Nadia Boltz-Weber puts it, everything we read online these days is meant to make us feel righteous and millions of other Americans look ridiculous. And we keep falling for it. This American routine is not going well. It's so ingrained now that even when we consciously seek to avoid demonizing others, we may harbor assumptions that are hard to get rid of. We struggle to distinguish between genuine, substantive disagreements and false, overblown characterizations of others. Our polarized ways disrupt families, towns, churches, friends. So, what's the difference between that kind of harmful, divisive rhetoric and the biblical tendency to clearly demarcate categories of righteous and wicked, or true wisdom and false wisdom. Well, let's back up for a moment and get a handle on what we are even reading in Psalms and James. In the Bible, there are many different and overlapping genres: narrative, poetry, history, prophecy, letters. And it can at times be quite obvious what genre we are reading. For example, the New Testament letters that Paul wrote are clearly letters. But it's also true that in one of Paul's letters, you might get a snippet of a philosophical argument drawn from somewhere else, and that might be right next to a quote from a hymn or a poem. So paying careful attention to what we are reading can help us to better interpret it. So what is the genre of our passages this morning? Psalm 1, like all of the Psalms, is clearly a poem. So it's not surprising that we find poetic images and metaphors. And James, found tucked in the back of the New Testament after Paul's letters, is also a letter, but written not to a specific community, more as a sort of open letter to multiple churches. So, again, it's not surprising that we find instruction on how to act as followers of Christ. But they also both fall into another category of writing in the Bible, and that is called wisdom literature. Wisdom literature at first sounds sort of highbrow to me, like you have to be very well-read and philosophical to understand it. But according to biblical scholar Ellen Davis, biblical wisdom literature is spiritual advice for ordinary people, and from ordinary people who make no claim to having received special revelation from God. In other words, biblical wisdom is not the kind of wisdom that you have to be an expert, an intellectual to understand. These parts of the Bible, unlike some books in the Bible, they aren't written by those who claim to be special prophets or priests or eyewitnesses to miracles. They're just regular people like you and me, processing God's wisdom in their ordinary lives, passing along something akin to common sense, but the kind of common sense that is acquired through generations of ordinary people seeking to live according to God's ways. Biblical wisdom literature also varies a lot. It can include very traditional sounding proverbs like this: lazy hands make poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes you rich. But it can also include writers using that same kind of practical wisdom to push back on conventional thinking, like the book of Ecclesiastes, which raises questions about whether the world really is so fair. But what it all has in common, this biblical wisdom, is that it often takes complicated faith concepts and tries to turn them into something clear and direct, words we can all understand in our ordinary lives. Now, the Bible contains lots of other kinds of writing and instruction, and that's for a reason. Where traditional wisdom may fall short of challenging long-held beliefs and injustices, the prophets can step in. Or where we need to see what these words look like lived out in real life, we have the stories of God's people or the stories of Jesus to help us really envision it. But there's something sort of beautiful to me about a tradition of wisdom of ordinary people reflecting on God's way in their lives. And the results can be clear and pointed in necessary ways, as we see today. Over the past couple weeks in sermons on James, we've heard helpful comparisons that help us not to judge and demonize others or divide the world too easily into categories, but to take an honest look at ourselves, our tendency to play favorites, or the impact our words can have, and today, the source of our so-called wisdom. When I think about James this way, I don't really hear divisiveness as much anymore. I hear an invitation to look at whether the ways we live are contributing to division or contributing to peace. Sometimes life is complicated, yes, but sometimes it is useful to look at the very clear difference between the way of God and the ways of the world that we are so tired of, yet so accustomed to. And it is useful to ask ourselves, which of the two ways are we following, are we listening to, are we attending to? So come back to our passages again from this angle, not to condemn others, but to have an honest look at ourselves, our communities, and the voices we are trying to sort out these days. Whether it's politics or parenting, church, or anywhere else, there are a lot of voices these days that claim to be expert-level, research-based, solid, and true. In fact, you can find evidence for just about anything if you look hard enough. But James urges us to ask, what are we looking for? Is it peace, mercy, and humility? Or are we giving in to the tricks of arrogance and self-centeredness? Do the voices we follow seem to flow from being rooted in the peaceable way of God, or are they chaotic and self-serving? It may be tempting, given our cultural divisions, to decide what's wise, not based on existing preconceptions. What's wise and what's not, based on existing preconceptions of which side of an argument is right, based on existing political and religious boundaries. But both James and the psalmist remind us that is not actually the way we can tell what true wisdom is. A wisdom that is from God will not be self-serving, will not be untruthful or evasive in order to get your vote or your dollar, will not stoke divisions in order to exploit them. A wisdom that is from God will sow in peace to make peace. Or as the psalmist reminds us, a fruitful life or community will not come from convenient alliances with those who sit in power only to scoff at others or profit off of them, but from being rooted in a patient, intentional reflection on God's ways. When you start to think about it, it becomes pretty easy to make lists of people claiming false wisdom, seeking power, stoking wars, neglecting justice. But where is the true wisdom these days? And what does it look like? As I thought about it, I kept coming back to the Guns to Gardens movement. It might sound familiar to you if you participated in an online conference we had a couple years ago on the topic of gun violence. But this movement, Guns to Gardens, is a faith-based movement trying to transform the tools of violence into tools of peace, inspired by the biblical prophets who proclaimed that one day the people would turn their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. The Guns to Gardens movement holds voluntary events where people can bring unwanted firearms and decommission them using a blacksmith's anvil. Later, these decommissioned guns are turned into tools that cultivate life in the garden. When I reread James' passage from today, the Guns to Gardens movement strikes me as exhibiting those qualities of true wisdom. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. This movement doesn't seek to overpower. No one is forced against their will to agree to a particular set of policies or be stripped of their possessions, but it creates a gentle, invitational space where those who want to can participate in sowing a kind of peace. At the first ever Guns to Gardens event in Colorado, there was a former infantry soldier. He resisted saying that this was a political act for him to be there. He'd bought an AK-47 after 9/11 in fear. But over time, and definitively after the Sandy Hook was in the news, that possession came to feel like a burden to him. He still planned to keep his hunting rifles, but the moment they chopped his AK-47 in half at that event, he said that he felt free. At another Guns to Gardens event in Philadelphia was a woman named Sherry Ryans, who'd lost her son at age 18 to crossfire. And as she pounded on a handgun on the anvil, she said after every word, "This is for my son." That gun was turned into a tilling fork used to plant flowers in memory of victims of gun violence across Philadelphia. Now, there are lots of ways and lots of kinds of wisdom about how to respond to gun violence, like any other issue in the world that causes you or me concern. You can buy more guns for protection. You can increase security. You can march across towns to your lawmaker's office, to your local social media group, and share all your thoughts. You might be able to quote a lot of statistics or even Bible verses to support your approach. And I'm not here to say that any of those approaches is necessarily wrong. But Guns to Gardens strikes me as more in line with the kind of true wisdom that James is talking about, and more in line with the biblical wisdom tradition as a whole. It is a movement that draws in people as different as a white military vet who insists he's not making a political statement, and a black urban mom who's a survivor and using her life as an activist for peace. It is a movement that doesn't require intellectual arrogance or scientific credentials. It is an effort of ordinary people to actually break away from the typical divisions our world imposes, and instead to offer a kind of wisdom that resonates with many who want to seek God's ways of righteousness and peace. The people in the movement come together in a gentle yet powerful way of being. They may not be as loud or as noticeable or as on the front pages as those who yell their opinions from the rooftops, but their impact is rather more like that of an ordinary tree, I think. They grow and they plant themselves, mangled and broken branches and all, by a stream of living water, knowing that they will bear fruit in season. And they remind all of us, ordinary people, that we don't need to be Bible experts or philosophers to follow in this tradition of biblical wisdom. In whatever issues concern us, day to day or globally, we can use our knowledge and experience of God to reflect on what the ways of peaceable, true wisdom look like. And with practice and thoughtfulness, we can become wise, just as they are.